Okay, I'm just going to get started and we will wait for others to join us. I know it's summertime, so people are very busy or traveling, but this will be recorded. So our first video that we uploaded has 150 views, so other people are interested that can't always be here in person. So we're glad to make it available in another way. So welcome to the third virtual meeting of the Critical Internationalization Studies Network. I'm Sharon Stein, convener of the network, and I'm speaking to you from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation in what is currently known as Vancouver, Canada. So even though our emphasis is on the international, it's always important to also ask what it means to be doing the work that we do in particular situated places and the ethical and political responsibilities that follow from that. So this network has been around for less than a year, and we have about 130 people on our mailing list so far, which is really great. And today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Abigail Boggs as our guest speaker. And I first learned of Dr. Boggs' work many years ago when I was a doctoral student, at which point I enthusiastically sent her an email asking if I could have a copy of her dissertation. And I'm pretty sure at the time she ignored me because she was understandably suspicious of this random person. But eventually, luckily, I was able to get her attention, and I'm very grateful that she has agreed to speak with us today. So after I give Dr. Boggs a proper introduction, she will give her talk, and then we'll have time for questions and conversations from you all. So we won't do introductions from everyone now, but if you have a question or a comment and you want to introduce yourself before you ask your question, that would be great. And I will record the talk and post it, but I won't post the part with our questions and conversations. So without further ado, Dr. Abigail Boggs is a scholar of feminist and queer studies with a focus on the transnational dimensions of the United States University. She joined the Wesleyan Sociology Department in the fall of 2016, is currently revising her first book, American Futures, International Students in the U.S. University, which is already on my preemptive reading list, and which provides a critical genealogy of the figure of the international student in university policy, federal immigration law, and U.S. popular culture. Her writing has appeared in the Barnard Center for Research and Women's Scholar and the Feminist, American Quarterly, and Feminist Studies, as well as the edited collection Mobile Desires, The Politics and Erotics of Mobility Justice. She's on the editorial board for Abolition, a journal of insurgent politics, and has served on the steering committee for the 5 College Center for Research on Women and American Studies Association's program committee. Welcome, Dr. Boggs. The floor is yours.
Okay, there we go. Thank you so much, Sharon. I don't remember getting that email about my dissertation. I'm pretty sure I was just embarrassed of the state of my work and was not feeling ready to share it. But that's very kind of you to say. And I have to say, I've been blown away by how productive you are. My friends and I who are who I write with and think with are just like, how does she publish something so often? And it's all so good. And it's a very exciting thing to get to be in conversation with you also. So thank you everyone for being here and for being willing to take some time to listen to my work. I have to admit it's the end of the semester, so it might be a little bit more rough and hopefully maybe more conversational than it might have been at a different time. I also might have overpromised with the title of my talk, but I think I'll explain how I got to the title, if nothing else, in the next 30 minutes or so. I just want to start by thanking Sharon for all the work she's done to organize this group. It's so impressive, and it's, to have 150 people watching the video and to have, I don't know how many people here joining us right now. It's really great to have this kind of broad location. Like Sharon, I think it's important to acknowledge where I am. I'm in on the historical and ancestral lands and current homelands of the Wangang people in what is known as Mattabesset or Middletown, Connecticut. I've been at Wesleyan now for 3 years, and I'm, as Sharon mentioned, I'm located in a sociology department. So that's weird for me. My training is not in sociology or really even in the social sciences. I'm a cultural studies scholar by training. I think that will come out in what I talk about today. I also want to acknowledge that I'm not really a scholar of higher education studies specifically, which I hope does okay with and for you all in our conversation. My training is very much in cultural studies, in transnational feminist cultural studies, queer studies, American studies, post-colonial studies, all of which I think can learn a lot from higher education studies. So basically, depending on where your training is coming from, I hope I can learn from you all today too. So I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint slides, partly because I feel embarrassed to be on video the whole time. Here we go. Yes, we'll do. All right, so I'll just get started with reading what I've got for you all. So it seems pretty evident, I think, especially to the folks gathered on this call, that it's a crucial time for scholars of higher education to think about the impulses behind and the material implications of internationalization. Like Sharon, I'm committed to a version of such an effort that insists on a historical and theoretical approach to our study of the university, one that contends with the various ways universities, such as the one where I teach and the ones by which I've been trained, which actually, I went to Wesleyan for my undergraduate and then to the University of California for my graduate work to UC Davis. So that might come up some of what I talk about. But that these institutions are steeped in Western-based logics of capitalism and liberalism, such as assumptions about individualism and private property, along with, and their attendant practices that underwrite the unequal distribution of life chances, so along racialized, classed, gendered, and nationalist lines. At the same time, I think it's really important, vitally important, in fact, to address the ways that these institutions are not just constituted by such logics, but instead function as a central technology through which the logics themselves are authorized, reproduced, and circulated. To levy such a critique is to take a departure from many progressive and leftist scholars who work on US higher education, at least coming from the worlds I come from American studies and kind of critical literature studies and other fields, who have often, in response to pressures of austerity measures and kind of critiques and retrenchment away from support for higher education, specifically public higher education, they've had a bit of a tendency to whitewash the history of US higher education, and in order to defend it as some kind of unambiguous public good. And I think, I've written about this recently in a piece I co-wrote with my friend and colleague Nick Mitchell, where we talk about what we call the crisis consensus, but basically how the university's goodness is often taken as an a priori. And in doing that work, it actually, in taking the university as a kind of always already good, work that does that often forecloses the capacity to really contend with the university's foundational violences and the ways the university has formed through and continues to operate both in relationship to and often in the service of the economies and practices of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, ableist heteropatriarchy, and many other kind of bad things that you don't like, or I don't like. I think Sharon's work is actually really helpful for thinking this also. I just taught this piece actually in a class this semester, and the students really appreciated it. In this piece, Confronting the Racial Colonial Foundations of US Higher Education, she's argued that confronting these foundational violences and our own complicity with them is a necessary part of any effort to unravel the harmful and inherited patterns of representation, relationship, and resource distribution that continue to shape the present. And so I want to kind of take that as a serious kind of way of entering into our conversation for today. So in order to grapple with these foundations, I found it necessary to think quite capaciously about the university. And in doing so, I've been inspired by Rod Ferguson's work in a number of ways. Specifically his effort to deploy the academy as a way to re-know state and capital as interlocutors with, rather than determinants of American university life, right? So rather than thinking of the university as something that is determined by the desires or the interests of the state and capital, to think of kind of a mutual constitution between what the university does and how the state and capital operate. This, I think, explains some of why I think of myself as a scholar who works on higher education rather than as a scholar of higher education studies, because I think more broadly, but in ways that can really benefit from the work coming out of the field of higher education studies. So Ferguson's line of thinking about this dynamic is also a large part of what brought me to the questions informing what I'm going to talk about today and where I'm trying to go with my work right now as I'm entering or continuing, I guess, the revisions of the book manuscript, which seem never ending. So the talk is titled The Non-Citizen Student, the State and Capital, and the Transnational Politics of the Neoliberal University. I think I might have overpromised a bit, but it's okay, we'll move along. Essentially, I want to ask how approaching the study of higher education through the figure of the non-white, non-citizen student or the international student enables a more robust and critical understanding of the various investments of the state, capital, and U.S. universities and colleges, and then more particularly, what this might reveal about the otherwise obscured entanglements of the state and capital with the university. So rather than collapsing the state and capital and assuming that they use or work through the university towards the same ends, how can we start to tease them apart a bit, and why might that be actually especially necessary right now? So to ask after the question of the state and capital 20 years ago, there was one text that one had to engage, at least, again, coming out of training in feminist studies, and that was Bill Redding's The University in Ruins. I'm not sure how widely read this text is in higher education studies. Yeah, okay. So there, Redding's polemically contends, this is in the moment of like 1994, 96, right? So post-Cold War, a particular moment in critical thinking. He argues that because the historical raison d'être, or the reasoning, the kind of modus of the modern Western university, has been tethered to the national cultural mission, the post-Cold War decline of the nation state has resulted in a different kind of institution. One no longer linked to the destiny of the nation state by virtue of its role as a producer, protector, and inculcator of an idea of national culture. In forwarding this line of argument, Reddings was in sync with much work emerging from what I understand to be the critical edges of higher education studies by scholars like Sheila Slaughter, Larry Leslie, and Gary Rhodes. Slaughter's now canonical collaborative work forwarded a thesis that the restructuring of public higher education has paralleled the neoliberal turn in the state. In doing so, they're essentially arguing that capitalism had triumphed over the nation-state form. Reddings and Slaughter and her co-authors were part of a much larger theoretical wave that decried not just the end of the nation state, but also the effective end of history. We think of someone like Francis Fukuyama's work, which there's no real necessary reason to engage, but it's part of the kind of historical moment of what was happening. Reddings described this as a process of Americanization, whereby the generalized imposition of the rule of the cash nexus comes to replace the notion of of national identity. Right, so capitalism triumphs, history is over because the Cold War is over. In other words, for these scholars, both the university and the state were subsumed by capitalist logics, desires, and modes of organizing the world. And this held, I think, a fair amount of sway in kind of the academic worlds I was in. I actually started reading it when I was an undergraduate and started working on the university, then around sex and pornography. And I found him frustrating then as well, but it's okay. So by the early 2000s, this confidence with which the nation state's power had been disavowed was roundly undone in the aftermath of the events of 9/11. And scholars became increasingly interested in and concerned with the imperial and nationalistic work of the university. Kind of one of the key texts, I think, in this genre of work is Sunaina Myra and Pia Chatterjee's writing in an edited collection, The Imperial University, in which they write that, quote, "The war on terror and the post-9/11 culture wars made hyper-visible the persistent role of higher education in shaping the discourses of nationalism, patriotism, citizenship, and democracy." This work built on insights from leading scholars of post-colonial studies, including Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak, who were both international students themselves in the 1960s, where they talked about the imbrications of the university as a site of nationalist training, and authoritative epistemological production. I do wonder, however, and I think I come back to this because I think there's something happened in the rush to recenter the nation state and questions of nationalism that allowed for a collapsing of the pedagogies of nationalism with the pedagogies of the state of capital. But I think might have gotten a little bit slippery, and I think that right now we actually need to come back to teasing those two things apart. So in our current moment of a kind of resurgent and recalcitrant ethno-nationalism, questions of the role of the university and its futures are as pressing as ever. But I don't know that we can think so simply about the nation and capitalism working in synchrony. So I'm trying in this talk today, and I think in the book, to tease those things out. And I think there's something specific about the figure of the international student as a liminal figure in relationship to the nation state, and as a very useful kind of person or person form figure for capital that can help us with that. So the crucial role, and again, I apologize if I go over things that are like so obvious to you all because of your training, because you all think about the university more than people I usually talk to. So just feel free to tell me if I'm doing too much of that. So the crucial role of international students for the budgetary stability of U.S. institutions of higher education has been quite apparent for a long time for anyone thinking about U.S. higher education, I think, particularly about internationalization. The depth of U.S. higher education's dependence on non-citizen students was first made very apparent, at least kind of contemporarily. There was a moment in the 1970s too, but in the kind of post 9/11 moment also. During that period, between the academic years of 03-04, there was this, in retrospect, rather minor decline, but a decline that was seen as being quite dire by university administrators, eventually by the president, by CFOs, by all kinds of players in the US economy, who feared that this slight decline was going to be kind of the end of the cash cow that folks thought they had in international students coming to the country. So, in 04, in the fall of 04, this I think is all from the Chronicle, but was covered in all these articles. Business Roundtable, which is a group of business executives from across the country, held a national conference in DC. President Bush held a US President Summit on international education, where he spoke and Laura spoke and Margaret Spellings, the Secretary of Education, spoke. It was a pretty big deal, and people were quite scared of what was going to happen. In the intervening 15 years since this occurred, the market has obviously jumped. For anyone following this, we're now at well over 1 million international students studying in the United States. IIE, the Institute for International Education, is happy to try and kind of trumpet the fact that these students are contributing $42 billion, I believe, as of now, to the U.S. economy. Kind of massive kind of contribution. This also was happening during the financial crisis, when many institutions and states were continuing to kind of take away state funding. So international students, specifically Chinese and Indian international students, kind of were courted to come in and kind of fill this gap. So now we have this giant boost of kind of how international students are imagined as a vital and kind of very important component of the finances and the kind of economy of U.S. higher education. So despite these impressive numbers, or perhaps because of them, the last 2 years have reignited prior fears about the dependence of these institutions on international students. Universities, corporations, state and federal agencies have developed a shared investment in the tuition payments, living expenses, and malleable campus labor, and almost immeasurable human capital potential international students contribute to university coffers, state economies, and capital expansion. At the same time, the growing presence of non-white, non-citizen students in the US and the concomitant reliance of universities as state and capital on this population has produced new forms of anxiety, especially since the rapid expansion post-2005. IIE's annual survey of international students in the US began to show a slackening in the market in the last couple of years, though. And this is kind of just making people, it seems, more scared. Let's see, and that started in fall 16, when there was a 2.4% decline in new international student enrollments. Data from the U.S. Department of State's supported IIE's finding. The number of student visas issued dropped from an all-time high of nearly 700,000 in 2015 to 471,728 in 2016. So a significant decline in a rather short period. Reports released in 2017 illustrated a continued intensification of the decline, with new enrollments decreasing another 6.6%, and new visa issuance dropping under 400,000, right? So nearly from 700,000 to around 400,000 in a period of 2 to 3 years. While the travel of international students to the US had begun to slow at the tail end of the Obama administration, it's widely assumed that the Trump administration's policies, postures, and public performance of overt xenophobia and racism has exacerbated already existing concerns regarding a new decline in student interest in US education and increased competition from abroad. For instance, Fall 2018 saw the first decline in international students applying to US graduate schools since 2003. The Council of Graduate Schools links this decline to changes in immigration policy spearheaded by the Trump administration, specifically in the executive order heavily restricting visas from several Muslim majority countries. And less so the actual order, because the actual order only impacts students from, I think, two countries, but more the kind of general sense of xenophobia and racism of kind of coming out of the administration towards international students. I find moments like these where kind of a material status quo is disrupted to be really telling, right? Not mostly, but in part because of the discourse that comes out around it. Kind of thinking of Foucauldian or through Michel Foucault, of a kind of explosive, the discursive explosion that occurs where otherwise kind of obscured relationships are made really apparent in new forms of discourse. So I think we've seen a lot of this happen in the last couple of years, where, again, otherwise underarticulated relationships between the university and international students, the university and the state, the university and capital, come to the surface. So a key example of this would be, again, around the travel ban, which, some water. So in the 2017 injunction blocking the implementation of the Trump administration's travel ban targeting majority Muslim countries, Judge Derek K. Watson granted the state of Hawaii legal standing because, as he wrote in his decision, quote, "The university is an arm of the state." And I really appreciate this, a clear articulation in case anyone was doubting what the role is. So since the state's public university recruits students, permanent faculty, and visiting faculty from the targeted country, suspending such individuals from entry will deter them from studying or teaching at the university, now and in the future, irrevocably damaging their professional and personal lives and harming the educational institutions themselves. In October, oh my goodness, I don't know what just happened. All right. In October of 2018, a diverse group of higher education institutions, including public community colleges like Foothill de Anza, two liberal arts colleges, the New School, and a few others, filed a lawsuit against Kirsten Nielsen, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, in which they contend that the government's proposed changes to the definition of unlawful presence will incite a massive reconfiguration of immigration laws relating to higher education, with enormously negative implications for student visa holders and higher education institutions' recruitment efforts. So again, another example of the state's immigration laws having this direct bearing and effect on institutions of higher education, that they kind of gain standing by kind of asserting the tethers or the ties between the state and the university. I will say that just a couple of days ago, this also had an injunction filed against it. I don't know that it's going to go through in the end, but it does bode really well for students currently in the U.S. For folks who don't follow U.S. immigration student policy. Basically, the policy was going to say a student's unlawful presence begins the day they get their degree, rather than the day that they are kind of contacted by the state. And if they are overstayed by more than 180 days, there's all kinds of consequences, as this says, where they can be barred from the country from 3 to 10 years. And many students have no idea when they're out of status, and the systems are not great for kind of any kind of information. So this is quite important for the actual lives of many students currently in the country. The other thing that is, I think, causing a lot of fear in the higher education community, particularly around international students, is, well, Stephen Miller in general, but really the kind of rhetoric he's been pushing around Chinese students, and kind of the idea that he would just fully end all international student visas. This actually seems to be going in more dangerous directions. In the last couple of days of news, this is just from yesterday, that a new bill is being proposed that would bar many different kinds of Chinese students from coming to the United States. And this is all happening both slowly and quickly. It's a weird time, obviously, in politics. One of the effects of that particular proposal has been most apparent at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I don't know if folks have seen this, but they, in the fall, took out a $424,000 insurance policy against international students, specifically Chinese students, stopping coming to the country. which would give them $60 million of coverage should some kind of ban go into an effect. But I believe that would only cover 1 year of their losses. So it would have really kind of long-term effects on the economy of UIUC, and shows kind of where capital is coming in, I think, to the university. So for me, this collection of stories opens up a number of questions about the contemporary politics of US higher education, the transnational movement of students, and with them money and ideas, and the particular and at times conflicting investments of the US government, institutions of higher education, and structures of capitalism in the presence of international students in the US. As the travel bans targeting of students from majority Muslim countries, and the particular and increasingly vocal concerns regarding Chinese students suggest, immigration law is unevenly applied, targeting populations marked as racially or culturally outside of the presumptive US norm of whiteness and Christianity. As such, a question emerges regarding what the US nation state is what to the US nation state is the population of non-white, non-Christian, non-citizen students, right? What purpose or use does this population serve? Who are they imagined to be? And what is the related yet distinct, I think, meaning of this population for capital? How might looking to the relationships of the state and capital to non-white, non-Christian, non-citizen students lay bare the entanglements of the state and capital with each other, their distinct interconnections with US universities, and the political, economic, and socially reproductive work institutions of higher education perform to the benefit of the United States as at once a governmental and an economic formation. I think it's kind of necessary to pull those two things apart. Again, Trump does interesting things to that too. So for what I have left of my time with you all kind of talking today, I want to just briefly talk about two key moments in US history that seem kind of removed and yet I think are really crucial to understand for today. That's the early 1920s and the early 1950s. It won't be too long, but I'm a little bit obsessed with history. But I also wanted to walk you through a little bit of the kind of theoretical framework that I'm using to think the relationship between capital and liberalism, because I'm not sure, well, I'm trying to think through it basically. And I would love your feedback on whether or not that makes sense. So in a lot of American studies in critical race, gender and sexuality studies, a story is often told when teaching regarding the coextensive historical rise of liberalism as a mode of political rationality centered on the individual and the modern nation state, and capitalism as a complementary economic formation based in private property and a fundamental split between capitalists, i.e. owners of the means of production, and wage laborers. More critical versions of this history argue that the history emerged in the 17th and 18th century because it was made possible by various European colonial efforts and the expropriation of land via enclosures, right? So that capitalism became doable at the same time that something like a nation state took form. But even in these more critical histories, capitalism and the state tend to be read as two sides of a coin, one political and the other economic, that function in synchrony and cultivate what has become, again, in the story that's told in kind of the fields that I'm in the US, a US-centric conception of the political and economic normal of liberalism and capitalism organized around and for kind of the abstract subject or citizen, both of which are presumed to be white, straight, able-bodied, independent men with property. My own engagement with these questions is quite informed by Lisa Lowe, Roderick Ferguson, and Grace Hong, and their work in which they contend that while much of that story might be true, there is a fundamental contradiction between the liberal state's desire for homogeneous citizenry and capital's desire for a heterogeneous and thus differentially exploitable workforce. Hong summarizes Lowe in her book Death Beyond Disavowal in writing that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the US nation state required a homogeneous citizenry, while US industrial capital required a heterogeneous workforce differentiated by categories of race that were always articulated through gender and sexual non-normativity. So since the inception of the nation state, there have been disparities in the rights granted to different segments of the citizenry along racial, gendered, and class lines. I think looking to the 1890s is a really important period to look at when, through Plessy and the ARC case, right, Black US citizens were granted citizenship, but not full citizenship, right, separate but equal, while birthright citizenship was granted to some Chinese, to the descendants of Chinese immigrants, but only because that citizenship was not really full and robust citizenship. There's also obviously a gendered history to unequal meanings of citizenship across the population. But I also want to follow another track on that, which Lisa Lowe follows, and I think Evelyn Nakano-Glenn does a nice job of thinking through also, in which citizenship status itself has always been differentiated across the population. But one of the most crucial kind of seizures or breaks in kind of the rights of people within a given territory are along the lines of the citizen versus the non-citizen. So here, Lowe thinks of the Asian immigrant as a paradigmatic figure for the racialized and gender worker who's alienated from citizenship, and that in being alienated from citizenship is hyper-exploitable under capital. And so the state's refusal of recognition or inclusion marks that as a different the population for exploitation by capital. Hong extends this argument, writing, quote, Asian migration to the United States is generated not only by the need for surplus labor within the domestic industrializing economy, but also as a residual effect of the United States' attempts to manage the pressures of a transnationalizing economy. And I think this maybe we can talk about this in Q&A, but we can think about kind of how the US's attempt to manage a transnationalizing economy has also created part of the desire for and drive towards the US as a space of higher education, right? So we think back to the US's involvement with IMF and the World Bank and various structural adjustment policies that have actually retracted support from public higher education in various countries receiving debt forgiveness or kind of loans that have forced countries to invest in primary education without a similar investment in higher education, that then opens up the US market as kind of really the only or one of the best markets to go to. So my work tries to bring these sorts of insights to bear on the transnational politics of US higher education by asking how immigration law specifically conditions non-citizen students as a population to be cultivated and surveilled, incorporated, but always only conditionally under temporal restrictions. I'm really invested in thinking about this work in the present and also about how it might condition the future. But as I kind of started off talking about a little bit, I think grappling with the present requires understanding the legal, social, and cultural foundations on which it is built. Hence my use of a genealogical method that works to trace out these foundations. So to kind of start to tease this out a little bit, I'm going to give you just a couple brief-ish examples. Time is running way more quickly than I thought, to think through this. So my first example is from the early 1920s. In 1930, Ruth Crawford, who was a sociology lecturer with a keen interest in international education at the University of Pittsburgh, wrote a report for IIE to explain what she described as the bewildering terms of the 1924 Immigration Act. She was particularly attentive to the confusing stipulations for administering visas for students in the United States. The Act instituted a draconian, for those of you who are less familiar with the 1924 Immigration Act, it was pretty disgusting and overtly racist and all kinds of other things. In its institution of a draconian, it also, though, instituted a draconian, temporarily restrictive standard for student travel to the US. It was predicated on a foundational exclusion, the law, of all all aliens of the yellow, brown, or red races who were, according to this act, deemed ineligible for citizenship, with the explicit goal to limit immigration of aliens to primarily white people. In instituting these strictures, the law simultaneously codified new categories for aliens, immigrant and non-immigrant, that provided exceptional access to the country to select categories of people otherwise disqualified from entering due to their racial identities and national affiliations. As Mitchell explains, the category of, quote, non-immigrant aliens permitted diplomatic officials, visitors, or businessmen to enter the country temporarily despite their racial or national excludability. The category of immigrant aliens was divided into three classes: quota, non-quota, and student. Under this law, both quota and non-quota immigrant aliens were provided a route to permanent residency, though not citizenship, and thus a life in the United States. But as the final two sentences of the quote that's up here, that's underlined, makes clear, international students were placed in their own distinct and temporally oxymoronic category as, quote, non-immigrant aliens granted temporary legal status. This is even as the designation immigrant suggests that a person has come to live permanently in a new country, students and students alone were required to make this move on an impermanent basis, placed in a distinctive and rather contradictory position that lays bare, I think, the ambivalence of the US state towards the figure of the non-white international student, one in which non-citizen students were deemed highly desirable for the nation state while simultaneously being held to heightened forms of administrative regulation due to the presumption that they pose a potential threat to national security and white laborers, right? So it was a question of both national security and capitalism. I don't need to go into this in too much depth, but I have another paragraph here, and I'm happy to discuss the fact that the inclusion of this special category for international students in the 1924 law was not a foregone conclusion. There was a brief moment in 1921 in the Emergency Quota Act when students were actually fully excluded from coming to the United States, or specifically students who would not otherwise be eligible for citizenship were excluded from coming to the United States. There was a whole agreement worked out by IIE with the Commissioner of Immigration that allowed students to come under bond and with kind of putting new restrictions on the IIE and also on the institutions of higher education, and starting to kind of incorporate universities and colleges into the apparatus of federal immigration restriction. The whole, again, I won't talk about this too much, but the question that was coming up from conservative senators who are anti-immigration, the concern was that international students came for the purpose of study, and that study was too vague a category to let be in the law. And there's trying to work through that, because I think if anyone's reading Moten and Harney, study kind of holds a certain kind of weight. So the next moment of immigration laws impacting international students that I want to focus on, there are others, but another next kind of major moment that shifted restrictions was the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, the McCarran-Walter Act, which again was supposed to be a remapping of US immigration law that was less racist, but it in fact was so racist that Truman himself wouldn't sign it. Like it was vetoed, and it's also not a great act. But for students, it imposed restrictions on their ability to work while in the US, which was a real blow to students who were struggling financially. It installed new processes of screening potential students and visitors, and included provisions authorizing the Attorney General to prescribe special regulations, forms for the registration of fingerprinting for students and for others. So kind of initiating some kind of biometric practices. The procedures were so onerous, they elicited pointed responses from some of the most powerful academic associations and scholars in the country, including the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, who put forward letters from Albert Einstein and Linus Pauling and other kind of important thinkers. The recategorization of students as non-immigrants located them squarely between the legal structures of immigration control and the administrative procedures reserved for non-immigrants as a special class. Students were subjected to the documented legal stipulations applied to immigrants regarding excludability, including assessments of good moral character and physical and mental defects, while also being subject to the specificities of a visa law that were unique to non-immigrant visitors. That is, while immigrants and non-immigrants alike were subject to the 1952 INA, there's something unique about aliens who seek to enter the country temporarily that differs from the long-term commitment imagined between a naturalized citizen and the state. Beginning in 1952, the INA required non-immigrants to convince the consular interviewer that they retained a residence in a foreign country, quote, a residence in a foreign country which he has no intention of abandoning. As Section 214B, which is still the law, reads, quote, every alien shall be presumed to be an immigrant until he establishes to the satisfaction of the consular officer at the time of application for a visa and the immigration officer at the time of application for admission that he is entitled to a non-immigrant status under Section 101A15. If anyone's talked to students who you work with or experienced the immigration process yourself or student visa process yourself, there's this dual moment of fear that kind of lingers, or kind of uncertainty. One during the interview, and the second one being actually coming to the United States, where you have your I-20 form that has to be sealed. And I've been talking to a number of students about the kind of experience of this, and it sounds really awful. So all of this is kind of the moment where international students enter into this, again, kind of conditional inclusion that's going to constantly be reevaluated, which produces a kind of very the word I'm looking for, kind of precarious relationship to one's present and one's future. So those are the kind of just two examples of how students get kind of positioned in these laws, both of which are kind of about kind of conditioning the student's relationship to the country as conditional and exceptional in terms of when and how it might be included. and kind of the sorts of oversight that this also then extends to the institutions themselves, right? That it's not just the students who get subjected to state oversight, but also the institutions that are administering their visas and their presence. So in order to leave time to talk, I think I'm gonna just kind of go to the end and wrap up with some questions that I hope maybe you all would be willing to talk to me about, basically about whether or not and how you see dynamics about international students and their conditional inclusion within the state playing out on your campuses or in your work today. My instinct is that through such policies regulating international students, the university is coming to function maybe less as an arm of the state or a social institution dedicated to just reproducing national values, or even strictly as economic enterprises. But instead that the university is functioning to actually do some kind of population management, a kind of a form of population control that is producing a new category of worker, a new category of membership. One case that I think is really helpful to think about right now is the Oracle case that was filed by the Department of Labor in the fall, where Oracle was accused of racial discrimination and underpaying their employees of color, and having preference for hiring international students, particularly because their conditional presence in the United States is dependent upon Oracle to sustain their visa, either when it's under OPT, the optional training practicum, or as a kind of moving towards an H-1B visa. So there's something I think really interesting happening in the Oracle case around questions of race, of capital, and of the state, and what kind of employee or figure is being conditioned in these dynamics. So that's one example. And then obviously, if we're following the news today, and the last couple of days, the new immigration proposal that the Trump administration is putting out regarding shifting over to more skilled laborers, but also, I forget the exact language, there's some quiz or test that they're going to require folks to take that are about relationships to the country. So I'm wondering kind of how does this population at once threaten the possibility of a homogenous population for the nation state, while simultaneously, I think, formalizing some kind of a new striated organization of belonging and responsibility between the state and individuals that might set some terms for how things move forward in kind of a complicated and shifting relationship between the state and capitalism. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there and see if you all have any questions or thoughts and feedback.
Thank you so much, Abby. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm going to have to rewatch this, I think. Yeah. So yeah, the floor is open to whoever wants to speak.